This is a new program offered by OutFront Kalamazoo. My name is Amy Hunter. I am the Executive Director of OutFront Kalamazoo. I couldn't be more happy to be doing the inaugural episode of Living Out Front with State Representative Jon Hoadley. He represents the 60th district, which is most of the Kalamazoo area, and he is in his third term as a state representative. Currently, Mr. Hoadley is running for Congress in the Michigan 6th district, and I'm so glad that we have him here today. If anybody has been living out front, it is Representative Hoadley. Jon and I go back many years and have done work together before, and we're great friends, and I couldn't be more pleased to have Jon on this morning. Representative Hoadley, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. The inaugural episode. This is cool. I'm glad I could be here.
All right. It's the inaugural episode. So I really wanted to talk about a couple of things today. What's it like living out front as a public service figure? What is the importance of voting, particularly in this election, and voting for equality-minded candidates? What is the importance of being a well-informed voter? And how can we make sure that we get our political discourse back on track?
Yeah, that's like a lot of topics, and I'm working on my first cup of coffee, so I'm excited. Let's do this.
So what's it like living out front, being an out gay man as a public servant?
Yeah, no, so I've been doing equality advocacy work my whole life. You know, when I first started, I remember being at Michigan State University and working with student groups to try to change the non-discrimination policy at Michigan State University to make sure we included gender identity as one of the protected classes that would then be prohibited forms of discrimination. And that was one of the first times that I saw the power that advocacy can have in terms of impacting policies for the LGBT community. And, I've been doing that type of advocacy work then my whole life. But what's interesting is being an elected official, it changes a little bit, right? And obviously, we're working on a ton of issues that directly impact people's lives in a very clear way. Whether we're talking about education in public schools, whether we're talking about the environment, racial justice, all of these issues are personal to people, and we all have stories. And I'll tell you, I think being an out elected official has meant that I've had to be really public about telling my story and how the laws that are being passed at the state level of government directly or indirectly impact my life. In our lives as LGBTQ people. And that experience has also, I hope, brought more empathy for issues that I can't say that I have personally experienced, but I understand how being shut out or left out of public policy or discourse changes people's lives. And so, I think, from a very sort of like public policy oriented perspective, it's meant that I try to have more empathy for so many of the situations that are coming in front of us. From a personal level, it also means that I don't think this is unique to any being an out elected official, right? But back when we used to be able to go to restaurants more and bars and stuff, the number of people that'll come up and they want to start talking about, public policy while you're out just having a beer with friends is sort of funny. And it also means though that where those intersect are sometimes when people want to come casually have a conversation about equality issues or other public policy while I'm out casually having fun with my friends. And, and sometimes they want to disagree. And you have to sort of like navigate those waters, right? Where it's someone maybe wants to ask an earnest question that's perhaps anti-equality in its nature, but at the same time, like you're out literally I'm out with my partner, Chris, or we're out with some LGBT folks, right? And you got to navigate all of that. But it's been such a privilege and I've loved doing it. And I know that having LGBTQ people in elected office has made a difference at every level of elected office. And so I hope this is part of why we need broad diversity and representation in our elected officials.
So it sounds to me like you're never really off duty. But the other big takeaway from your answer that I got was you've been able to bring a sense of intersectionality about how public policy intersects the lives of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans and queer people. I know personally your championship of amending the L.A. Larson Civil Rights Act has given the citizens of Michigan many opportunities to bring that dialogue to the forefront and talk about our personal stories and lobby our legislators and tell them what it's like to be discriminated against just because of who you are or who you love. So I want to move on, though, to our current political discourse. We've seen in the last few years with the administration that came in 2016, a lot of protections that had been put into administrative rules being rolled back, gutted. I'm thinking about non-discrimination in healthcare, non-discrimination in access to emergency shelters, reproductive rights, things that have huge bearings on the LGBTQ community. How do we combat that? How do we fix that over the next few years? Let's assume that we have a different outcome in this coming up election in November. How are we going to fix that stuff, and why does it make such a big difference?
So many of the protections that you're talking about exist in administrative rulemaking. Now, not all of them, but many of those protections exist in administrative rulemaking. And what that means is that the way that the particular words or phrases that are written into a bill or exist under other authority, the way that they are interpreted has a consequence on how that law is going to apply to our lives. And I mean, this is like a billboard that says elections have consequences. And, having folks in an executive function, whether it's Governor Whitmer or whoever wins the White House in 2020, matters because the executive and many of the rulemaking functions, actually, the way that they read the words will have a big impact. And by the way, I think this is really clear when we try to make sure that that laws are written in plain language, but we've seen over time how many of those laws have not been updated as we've moved forward. And so there's language that evolves with time. And the question is it still having the original purpose? And the simple answer to all of this would be that if we want to make sure that we have modern clarity, then let's pass laws and let's update laws to reflect the current realities in which we live. Mm-hmm. But we have seen so much dysfunction. We've seen a lack of process in so many of the legislative functions, whether that's even at the state legislative level or the federal level, where we've seen Mitch McConnell in the U.S. Senate just refuse to take up bill after bill after bill that's been duly processed out of the House, even if they're going to say yes or no to it, but take it up and have some action. But they don't, because there's this broad process that's happening now, which says that for many of the bills, they just choose not to have a yes or no vote. And I think that speaks to so many of the frustrations that not just LGBTQ people have, but everybody does, right? We've all been taught a Schoolhouse Rock version of how the legislative process is supposed to work. And how can you hold your elected officials accountable about the way they vote if part of the way they game that system is just never let those votes come up for a process? And so that's the kind of frustration that we're seeing. We are not seeing big action on some of the biggest issues facing our country right now, whether it is equality issues, whether it's childcare issues, student debt issues, healthcare issues, because bills move out of a chamber and then they just sit. And I think we need to change that. And that's one of the things that is that we could do right now. By electing more pro-equality candidates, we could then make a commitment to moving more pro-equality legislation, because our lives are on the ballot. I mean, they really are.
Right. So even if administrative rulings such as the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557 are nice, but if it's in plain language in the law, not an interpretive statement that the Office of Civil Rights has jurisdiction over, the Health and Human Services OCR jurisdiction, we're all much better off. We're all much better off. So what that means is that we have to have at all levels of government a robust process that is steeped in good faith. I think if there was one thing that our founders were a little more optimistic on than I would have liked to have seen them be, was that our system of government depends on forbearance. It depends, just because you can do a thing like Mitch McConnell can sit on all of the bills coming out of the House, doesn't mean he should do it. Just because they can ram a Supreme Court justice through doesn't mean they should do it, particularly this close to the election.
And the thing I'll note here too is that there's also informal rules that prevent action. So
Right.
We're usually taught this idea that if a bill has majority support in a chamber, it'll move forward. But the reality is that there's been informal rules adopted, typically within the Republican caucus, that says unless a bill has a majority of the majority, they won't move the bill for consideration, which means that there are bills in some cases in the Michigan legislature that might have, 70 plus people willing to vote for it, but 20 Republicans and 52 Democrats in the state House. 20 Republicans is not a majority of the majority. So by that informal rule, they won't move a piece of legislation forward. I mean, in what world were the founders anticipating that, surpassing, 2/3 vote, or getting over 70 of the 110 members to say yes, that somehow would not be, that we wouldn't move those type of bills. And for folks that really want to see us get past a two-party system, that want to see us shake things up in Lansing or DC, these types of informal rules are also problematic, because this is, again, there is no such thing as the majority of the majority rule in that Schoolhouse Rock version, and people are surprised when they find these things out.
Right, the majority of the majority rule, the filibuster, was actually a mistake. It was promulgated by Aaron Burr when he was vice president. I won't go into the whole sordid history of that, but
then the podcast takes a real interesting turn back in historical.
Real interesting turn towards Aaron Burr and dueling. But you're absolutely right. The norms and that doesn't necessarily mean compromising your principles. It means allowing the process to work as it was meant to work, as it was envisioned by our founders.
That's right.
So another thing that I find very alarming is the use of disinformation in campaigning. We live in the era, I don't think anyone would disagree with me on this, when disinformation dominates our political discourse. And I know that there's recently been some anti-transgender bills run in Michigan for no particular reason. There's nothing trans related in a ballot measure in November. They seem to be efforts just to gin up support of the base of one party. And I know that that's personally hurtful to me, and it's very hurtful and potentially dangerously hurtful to other members of the LGBTQ community, particularly trans women of color. Some of the same kind of rhetoric has been levied at you as a candidate for the Michigan 6th congressional district. How has that changed the way that you are campaigning?
So I think we can all agree that we should be in a world where facts matter, truth matters. And I think every one of us has experienced when there are, if in our regular day jobs, if we go and tell a lie, if we lie to our bosses, right, we we suffer the consequences. That's how having a job works. Unfortunately, but when it comes to political campaigns, there is so much latitude to tell lies about your opponent, and it's wrong. And I think we need to change it. You know, with setting aside the conversation that we should be having, by the way, about platforms, Twitter, Facebook, some of the biggest tech giants who are allowing and profiting off of individuals telling lies and then saying they're not culpable for that. We still deal with it in traditional media and traditional campaigns as well. There's an attack ad right now about me that talked about votes that we took in the legislature. And these claims, particularly around questions about this police funding, Fred Upton's approved ads were called false by PolitiFact and the Detroit Free Press. False. He's still running the ad, and it's unfortunate because when that's literally spending money to move forward a conversation that isn't true, and I don't think that's right. We also see dark money groups right now who are intentionally twisting my record and really going to the oldest LGBTQ tropes, using stereotypes, things that have now been corrected or fact checked, and they don't change any of their rhetoric. And I'll tell you, that is so hurtful and dangerous overall. And I do want to say, this isn't just my race. We're actually seeing these type of anti-LGBTQ attacks happened against LGBTQ candidates all over the country right now. So this isn't just an isolated incident. I mean, the Victory Fund has said that the attacks in my race are the most homophobic in the country, but so many other LGBTQ candidates are facing this right now as well. And it's intentional, and it is meant to gin up discriminatory images, stereotypes, and tropes to try to score cheap political points. And I think that's wrong.
So this lying, and I'll just call it what it is, lying about your opponent in ads. What does that do to our overall political discourse in the country? I know for me, I get despondent almost when I see the dark money ads running, and I know for a fact that what they're talking about is false, completely false. What do you think it does to our overall political discourse and our system? What is the long-lasting harm to our system of government from this sort of campaigning?
I think we have to be very careful moving forward, because these sort of attacks that allow fact-free campaigning are damaging. Because if you want to elect officials who are there to fight for good public policy, there is now, with these types of false ads that are allowed to run without any consequence, there is a disincentive in terms of getting the policy right. And our lives on so many issues depend on getting the policy right, whether we're talking about healthcare votes that we take in the legislature, what we fund, who gets access, who doesn't. Are we going to stand up and check the power of health insurance companies so you have power over your treatment with your doctor as opposed to, a private insurance company? Are we going to check that power? Getting that policy right sometimes could have less impact because, regardless of how you vote, someone is going to just run a fact-free ad against you. And so I think there's a long-term disincentive. The second piece, though, is that these types of ads that just allow people to tell lies about your character or your background or whatnot dissuades folks from raising their hand to contribute to public policy. Look, we're going to need, our system works well when we have people of all walks of life who are willing to raise their hand and say, hey, I've got some ideas to contribute to this conversation too. But if they know that regardless of their background, their experience, or their values, that a dark money group, who we may never know who the donors are going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to lie about them or their character or their families, then people are like, I'm gonna stay out of this. And we lose as a country because the next best idea might choose not to say anything at all because they're just worried that there's going to be a lie told about them. And then the only folks who are willing to run moving forward are maybe those that are the wealthiest that can then tell their whatever story they want because they have enough money to buy that speech. So this is why
So
this
our
is
politics,
dangerous.
right? So our politics becomes about ideology, becomes about accumulation of power and wealth rather than principle and good policy.
That's right.
Is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and and I think we should fix that. I will say
Yes, right.
the way we start to fix that are we need to make sure that we're dealing with gerrymandered districts. We need to make sure we're dealing with voting rights. So every legal person who wants to vote, who is legally allowed to vote, can vote. And we need to start tackling this dark money in politics and frankly, money in politics overall. So the wealthiest and well-connected don't get to buy more speech than everybody else. It also means that we need to demand accountability for the folks that are lifting up the political discourse and profiting off of that political discourse, that they have to make sure that they are not profiting off of lies, that they don't bear profit from the fruit of the poison tree. And so this is an example where I will say, folks in Michigan, great job in 2018 when we passed Proposal 2 that's working on nonpartisan redistricting. Great job on Proposal 3 when we passed the Voter Bill of Rights that's helping more people who are legally allowed to vote actually make sure they access the franchise that they are entitled to. And now we got to make sure we're still tackling that money in politics issue because that'll be the next big hurdle that we have to get right.
Gotcha. So it sounds like our best bet is to become informed voters. Do homework. There are a number of resources. I know I looked you up on Ballotpedia just to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. And well, I knew you anyway. But there are places that you can research your candidates and find out what their policies they've voted for in the past. And if you agree, vote for them again. If you disagree, maybe they're not the candidate for you.
The Pride Source Media always does a really good LGBTQ ballot guide. And so, be on the lookout. I'm sure that OutFront will have those links available to their nonpartisan pro-equality ballot guide when that becomes available. But, I think you're exactly right. There's tons of voter education resources. And then the other thing, though, is I want people to make sure that they're doing their homework, not just about what the candidate's saying, but how they vote on things. I think that's important.
Right.
Also, what are they not saying? We are living in a moment that demands courage. And so when folks are seeing the wrong thing happening, are they saying something about it? And, unless people are willing to raise their hand and say, that's not right, or that, to condemn hateful words or hateful actions, then, it really begs the question, if you're not willing to stand up and do the right thing on some of the most blatant, easy things, then how are you ever going to do the right thing on the hard stuff too? Because fixing our healthcare system is hard. Fixing and changing our environmental policies so we deal with the climate crisis and our drinking water crisis, that's hard. Figuring out how we're going to get green jobs and jobs to Southwest Michigan, that's hard. So if you're not willing to do the easy stuff well, then how are you ever going to do the hard stuff?
Right, exactly. John, I think we'll end it here, unless you have a closing statement of any kind. I'd like to know, how can people, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I appreciate you taking the time, educating folks. Of course, if they want to learn more about me, they can always go to jonhoadley.com, JONHOADLEY.com, learn more about my values or the issues that I care about. And, the other piece, though, is get out and vote, right? Do that homework. There's tons of good resources, but just remember that there is so much on the line on this ballot. We saw that there's going to be a Supreme Court appointment, and our marriage equality in Michigan is only legal because of one vote on the Supreme Court. when we talk about non-discrimination protections that we enjoy in Michigan right now, it's because of just but 2 votes on the Supreme Court. Healthcare is on the ballot. Choice is on the ballot. Immigration is on the ballot. These issues are on the ballot. And we need to make sure that we're electing pro-equality, candidates up and down the ballot so we can see change in DC. We can see change at our state legislative level. We can see change at our local levels. So I want to say thank you for taking the time today to listen. Amy, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate all the work you're doing. And remember, folks can vote anytime between now and November 3rd. So your vote is your voice, and let's make sure our voices are heard loud and clear at the ballot box.
Representative Hoadley, I could not be more pleased that you were the guest on our inaugural Living Out Front. You can find resources on our website, outfrontkazoo.org. You can also find out about Jon's stances on issues and what he thinks about particular policy stances at, say it again.
JonHoadley.com.
Great, thank you. Jon, thank you again. And thank you. Join us next month for another critical conversation. I'm Amy Hunter. This has been Living Out Front.